The rain came down in sheets, turning the streets of the town into a maze of glistening black puddles. Alice had almost closed up her small florist shop for the night when the bell over the door jingled. She looked up, expecting a drenched late customer, but the door remained ajar and empty. Frowning, she moved to close it, but something caught her eye. A package sitting just inside the threshold, wrapped in damp brown paper. A handwritten note was tied to the top with twine, its ink smudged but still legible under the dim glow of the shop's lights. "Deliver this to Briarwood Manor. Tonight." Alice's brow furrowed. Briarwood Manor. Everyone in town knew it. An abandoned relic on the edge of the woods, swallowed by time and vines. No one had lived there for decades, not since the tragedy that left the place derelict and shrouded in grim rumors. Yet here was a package bearing its name, the rain-soaked handwriting stark against the paper. The package was surprisingly light. Curious, she unwrapped it, revealing a bouquet unlike any she'd ever seen. The flowers seemed to shimmer faintly, their colors too vibrant for the gloom of the shop. Blood-red roses with petals like velvet, pale lilacs that glowed faintly in the dim light, and deep black calla lilies arranged in an otherworldly harmony. They smelled faintly of earth and something sweeter, almost cloying, that made her head swim. Alice hesitated. There was no signature, no return address. Delivering flowers after hours was odd enough, but to that place, she felt a shiver of unease, the sort that creeps in when you know you're about to do something you'll regret. But something about the bouquet held her captive, a magnetic pull she couldn't quite explain. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her umbrella and keys and stepped out into the night. The drive to Briarwood Manor was short, but harrowing. The narrow road twisted through dense trees that seemed to close in tighter as she approached. Her headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof became an oppressive drumbeat. The manor emerged suddenly from the gloom, its silhouette stark against the stormy sky. The building was a monument to neglect. Ivy strangled its stone walls, and its shattered windows gaped like empty eyes. The gate creaked as Alice pushed it open, her umbrella barely holding back the deluge. She approached the door, Bouquet clutched tightly in one hand. There was no doorbell, only a rusted knocker shaped like a grinning gargoyle. She hesitated, the cold biting through her thin coat, but the pull of the bouquet urged her forward. She raised the knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house had swallowed it. Alice waited, each second dragging into an eternity. No one came. After a few more knocks, she gave up. She set the bouquet on the doorstep, its vivid colors stark against the weathered stone. Turning back toward her car, she caught a glimpse of movement in the upper window, a flicker of shadow against the dim interior. She stopped, staring into the darkness, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Alice hurried back to her car, heart pounding. The bouquet stayed in her mind all the way home, its impossible vibrancy haunting the edges of her thoughts. That night, the storm grew fiercer, battering against her windows, but sleep eluded her. The feeling of being watched lingered long after she'd locked her door. Alice woke late, her head heavy and fogged. The storm had subsided, leaving the morning draped in a mist that clung to the streets like a second skin. She dressed quickly, eager to shake off the strange events of the previous night. But when she entered her shop, she froze in the doorway. The bouquet was there, sitting on the counter where she made her arrangements. Her mind raced. She had left it at Briarwood Manor. She was certain of it. The door had been locked when she left last night, and the shop showed no signs of a break-in. Yet here it was, pristine and undisturbed. The flowers seemed even more vivid in the pale morning light, their colors pulsing faintly as though alive. The scent, sweet and earthy, was stronger now, filling the small space and making her stomach churn. She backed away, her hands trembling. "This isn't possible," she whispered. The bell above the door jingled, breaking her trance. A regular customer, Mrs. Hawthorne, shuffled in, her umbrella dripping rainwater onto the floor. The elderly woman greeted Alice cheerfully, but stopped mid-sentence when she noticed the bouquet. Her face turned ashen. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alice hesitated, the memory of the shadowed window at Briarwood flashing through her mind. It was a delivery request for Briarwood Manor, but Mrs. Hawthorne cut her off, shaking her head violently. "You must get rid of it. Burn it if you can. That bouquet, it's cursed." The words hit Alice like a physical blow. "Cursed?" she repeated, her laugh hollow. "It's just flowers." "No," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a relic of vengeance. Anyone who keeps it will be destroyed." Before Alice could ask more, Mrs. Hawthorne fled the shop, leaving her with the bouquet and a rising sense of dread. She grabbed her phone, intending to call the police, but as she turned back to the counter, the bouquet seemed closer than before, as though it had moved while she wasn't looking. The room felt colder, the light dimmer, and for the first time, Alice noticed the shadows curling around the flower's stems, as though the bouquet itself was alive. Alice didn't sleep that night. She stayed in her cramped apartment above the shop, her eyes fixed on the bouquet resting on her coffee table. It sat there, unnervingly still, but the air around it felt alive, thick with an oppressive energy that made her chest tighten. Every so often, the faint scent of the flowers, sweet and cloying, seemed to shift, becoming something sharper, almost metallic. At dawn, she resolved to act. With a heavy blanket wrapped around the bouquet to avoid touching it, she drove to the edge of town, where an overgrown lot served as an unofficial dumping ground. The moment she placed the bundle on the ground, she felt an overwhelming wave of relief. She stepped back, ready to leave, but a flicker of movement caught her eye. The blanket shifted. Her breath hitched as the fabric wriggled, then fell away, revealing the bouquet in its impossible vibrancy. The flowers stood upright, their colors now brighter than ever, petals trembling as though stirred by an unseen breeze. For one surreal moment, she thought she heard whispering, faint and indistinct, emanating from the blooms. Alice stumbled backward, her mind screaming for her to run. She reached her car in a blind panic and sped home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When she returned to her apartment, she froze in the doorway. The bouquet was on her coffee table, exactly where it had been before. Her knees buckled. She fell into a chair, head in her hands, trying to process the impossible. Her thoughts raced back to Mrs. Hawthorne's warning. A relic of vengeance, the old woman had called it. Cursed. The word felt ludicrous, but how else could she explain what was happening? Her logical mind offered no answers, only the gnawing fear that the bouquet was far from ordinary. Desperate, she searched online for anything resembling her experience. Hours later, her eyes burned from staring at her laptop screen, but her efforts bore fruit. A local forum post from years ago mentioned the bouquet, a strange, cursed object tied to Briarwood Manor. According to the post, the bouquet had been created by a woman named Lillian Greaves, a scorned lover whose grief had twisted into something darker. Legend said she had infused the flowers with her rage and sorrow, cursing them to exact vengeance on anyone who dared keep them. Alice's hands trembled as she scrolled further. The stories were vague, but the outcomes were clear. The bouquet destroyed those it touched, leaving behind ruin and death. No one had survived it. Her apartment felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing in. The bouquet's scent grew stronger, making her dizzy. Shadows curled at the edges of her vision, and she thought she saw them move, creeping closer. Panic bubbled in her chest, and she slammed the laptop shut, the room plunging into silence. She needed answers. She needed help. Alice drove back to Briarwood Manor as twilight descended, the horizon stained in hues of blood red and deep purple. The house loomed ahead, its crumbling facade dark against the fading light. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to leave the cursed Bouquet and its horrors behind. But she couldn't. The pull was too strong, as though the flowers themselves demanded her presence. The Bouquet sat on the passenger seat, unwrapped now, its colors glowing faintly in the gloom. Alice avoided looking at it directly, but she could feel its presence, heavy and watching. She clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white. When she reached the manor, the grounds were eerily quiet. The surrounding trees swayed without a breeze, their branches scratching against one another like whispered warnings. Alice parked and stepped out, clutching the Bouquet in her trembling hands. The front door creaked open at her touch, revealing a hallway cloaked in darkness. She moved forward, the Bouquet growing heavier with each step, its scent thickening until it felt like it was suffocating her. She found the garden at the back of the house, now overgrown and wild. The air was colder here, biting against her skin despite her coat. In the center of the tangled greenery stood a weathered stone altar, its surface etched with strange looping symbols. Alice felt a pang of recognition. She had seen these shapes in her frantic online search. They were tied to a ritual, one that could break the Bouquet's curse. On trembling legs, she approached the altar and set the Bouquet down. As her hands left the flowers, the shadows in the garden seemed to shift, coalescing into something larger, darker. A figure emerged from the gloom, a tall, shapeless silhouette that radiated malice. Its presence filled the space, oppressive and suffocating. Alice's breath hitched. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't speak, but the garden around her responded. The air shimmered, the symbols on the altar glowing faintly. Alice fumbled in her coat pocket, retrieving the token she had brought, the locket containing her mother's photograph. It was her most cherished possession, a symbol of love that she hoped would counteract the curse's hatred. With shaking hands, she placed the locket beside the Bouquet. The air grew colder still, and the figure loomed closer, its formless mass shifting like smoke. Alice's voice quivered as she spoke the incantation she had memorized, each word feeling heavy and wrong in her mouth. The shadows recoiled, swirling violently as the altar pulsed with light. The Bouquet ignited in a flash of crimson flame, its petals curling into ash as the figure writhed and shrank. The garden erupted in chaos. Wind howled, trees bent under unseen pressure, and the air filled with a deafening roar. Alice fell to her knees, shielding her face from the blinding light. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, the Bouquet was gone. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of burned flowers. Alice collapsed, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. She had survived. But as the quiet settled over the garden, a new fear took root. Had the curse truly been broken? Or was it waiting for her, biding its time? Alice didn't remember driving home. Her body moved on autopilot, her mind a foggy blur of exhaustion and lingering dread. The streets were deserted, cloaked in the oppressive quiet of the late hour. When she finally reached her apartment, she stumbled inside and locked the door behind her. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the silence, but it offered no comfort. Her hands trembled as she lit a candle and collapsed onto the couch. The faint scent of smoke still clung to her skin, mingling with a hint of sweetness that turned her stomach. She glanced at her coffee table, half expecting the Bouquet to have returned, its impossible colors glowing in defiance of logic. But the table was empty. It was over. That thought should have brought relief, but Alice couldn't shake the unease coiled tightly in her chest. The air in the apartment felt heavier, the shadows in the corners darker, more substantial. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just the aftermath of her ordeal. The bouquet was gone, destroyed by the ritual. Whatever power it had over her life was broken. And yet, the unease remained. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Her bed felt foreign, the sheets stifling against her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flicker of flames consuming the bouquet, heard the deafening roar of the wind in the garden, and felt the suffocating presence of the shadowy figure. The memory of its formless mass, radiating malice, sent a shiver down her spine. Hours passed. When the clock struck 3, Alice gave up on sleep. She dragged herself to the kitchen for a glass of water. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against the ears like a held breath. She paused by the window, staring out at the darkened street below. That's when she smelled it. Faint at first, barely noticeable. But it was there, the cloying sweetness of the bouquet. Her stomach clenched, and she spun around, her eyes darting across the room. It wasn't possible. She had destroyed the flowers, seen them burn to ash with her own eyes. Yet the scent lingered, growing stronger with each passing second. Alice's breath quickened as a soft rustling sound broke the silence. Her gaze snapped to the coffee table. It was still empty. She scanned the room, her heart pounding in her ears. The rustling came again, this time from the hallway that led to her bedroom. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, it's gone. I got rid of it." But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. The shadows in the hallway seemed to writhe, shifting unnaturally, and a faint glow began to bloom in the darkness. Her chest tightened as she recognized the light, a pulsing, otherworldly hue that could only belong to one thing. The bouquet emerged from the shadows. Its colors were more vivid than ever, the petals impossibly pristine, as though the flames had only fed its malevolence. The flowers seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with an unnatural rhythm. Shadows coiled around its base, writhing like living things, and the cloying scent filled the room, choking Alice's every breath. Her legs buckled, and she fell to the floor, unable to look away from the bouquet. It sat in the hallway, still and yet alive, radiating an energy that pressed down on her like a physical weight. The faint rustling grew louder, taking on the cadence of whispers, indistinct at first, then clearer. "Alice!" The voice was soft but unmistakable, seeping into her mind like a cold, invasive tendril. It repeated her name, drawing it out in a lilting, mocking tone. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" she choked, her voice barely audible. The bouquet didn't answer, but the shadows around it began to shift, taking shape. A figure emerged, tall and formless, its eyeless gaze locked on her. It extended a hand, or something resembling a hand, toward her, its elongated fingers curling like claws. Alice screamed, the sound raw and primal, but there was no one to hear. The bouquet remained, its glow intensifying as the shadowy figure loomed over her, filling the room with an oppressive darkness that swallowed the light. She closed her eyes, bracing for the end, but the whispers abruptly stopped. The air grew still, and the scent faded. When she opened her eyes, the hallway was empty. The bouquet was gone. Alice sat frozen, her body trembling. Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept into the room, she dared to move. Her apartment seemed normal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. On the windowsill, unnoticed until now, lay a single petal. Black as night, its edges curling inward like a twisted smile.